as in quarters we lay, which you quickly shall hear. Lord Paget came to us and bid us prepare. Come saddle your horses, for we must ride soon, for the French are now lying in the town of Sagon.
As soon as the enemy's order of battle was formed, they cheered in a very gallant manner and immediately began firing. The 15th then halted, wheeled into line, huzzaed, and advanced. The interval betwixt us was perhaps 400 yards, but it was so quickly passed that they had only time to fire a few shots before we came upon them, shouting, "Emsdorf victory!" The shock was terrible. Horses and men were overthrown, and a shriek of terror, intermixed with oaths, groans, and prayers for mercy, issued from the whole extent of their front. Our men, although surprised at the depth of the ranks, pressed forward until they had cut their way right through the column. In many places, the bodies of the fallen had formed a complete mound of men and horses. But very few of our people were hurt. Colonel Grant, who led the right centre squadron, and the adjutant who attended him were amongst the foremost who penetrated the enemy's mass. They were both wounded, the former slightly on the forehead, the latter severely in the face. It is probable neither of them would have been hurt if our fur caps had been hooped with iron like those of the French chasseurs, instead of being stiffened with pasteboard. It was allowed by everyone who witnessed the advance of the 15th that more correct movements, both in column and in line, were never performed at a review. Every interval was accurately kept, and the dressing admirably preserved. The attack was made just before daybreak, when our hands were so benumbed with intense cold that we could scarcely feel the reins or hold our swords. The French were well posted, having a ditch in their front, which they expected to check the impetus of our charge. In this, however, they were deceived. After the horses had begun to gallop, indeed the word of command, "Left squadron to support," was passed from the centre, but so indistinctly that Major Leach did not feel authorised to act upon it, and at that moment we were so near the enemy that it would have been difficult to restrain either the men or the horses. My post being on the left of the line, I found nothing opposed to my troop, and therefore ordered, "Left shoulders forward," with the intention of taking the French column in the flank. But when we reached the ground they had occupied, we found them broken and flying in all directions, and so intermixed with our hussars that, in the uncertain twilight of a misty morning, it was difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Notwithstanding this, there was a smart firing of pistols, and our lads were making good use of their sabres. Upon reaching the spot where the French column had stood, I observed an officer withdrawn from the melee. I followed, and having overtaken him, was in the act of making a cut at him, which must have cleft the skull, when I thought I distinguished the features of Lieutenant Hancock's, and, as I then remarked, he wore a black fur cap and a cloak, which, in the dim light of the morning, looked like blue. I was confirmed in the idea that he belonged to our regiment. Under this impression, although his conduct in quitting the field at such a period struck me as very extraordinary, I sloped my sword, and merely exclaiming, "What, Hancock's? Is it you? I took you for a Frenchman," I turned my horse and galloped back to the scene of the action. The shock I felt from the idea that I'd been on the point of destroying a brother officer instead of an enemy deprived me of all inclination to use my sword except in defence of my own life. Many mistakes of the same kind must have occurred in the confusion after the charge. One of our men told me that I had a narrow escape myself, for that during the melee he had his sword raised to cut me down, but luckily recognised his officer in time to withhold the stroke. At this time I witnessed an occurrence which afforded a good deal of amusement to those who were near the place. Hearing the report of a pistol close behind me, I looked around and saw one of the 15th fall. I concluded that the man was killed, but was quickly undeceived by a burst of laughter from his comrades, who exclaimed that the awkward fellow had shot his own horse, and many good jokes passed at his expense. The melee lasted about 10 minutes, the enemy always endeavouring to gain the carry-on road. The appearance of their heavy dragoons was extremely material and imposing. They wore brass helmets of the ancient Roman form, and the long black horsehair streaming from their crests as they galloped had a very fine effect. Having rode together nearly a mile, pell-mell, cutting and slashing each other, it appeared to me indispensable that order should be re-established, as the men were quite wild and the horses almost blown. Therefore, seeing no superior officer near, I pressed through the throng until I overtook and halted those who were farthest advanced in pursuit. As soon as I had accomplished this object, the bugles sounded the rally. Whilst we were reforming our squadrons, the enemy also rallied and continued their flight by different routes. Our left and left centre squadrons were detached in pursuit of the chasseurs à cheval, who took the road to Carrion. The other two squadrons followed the dragoons, who retired in the direction of Saldanha. So that's an account by Captain Gordon of the 15th Hussars, who you may remember from earlier in the season. It's from the Battle of Sahagun, December 1808. It's a fascinating and detailed description of a Peninsular War cavalry charge and gives a real sense of the excitement and confusion of such a moment. On this occasion, the charge was a successful one, but the British cavalry of the Peninsular War are often criticised. After a particularly reckless and wasteful pursuit by his cavalry under Major General John Slade during the Battle at Magia in June 1812, Wellington famously wrote, "I've never been more annoyed than by Slade's affair, and I entirely concur with you in necessity," this was to Hill, "of inquiring into it. It is occasioned by the trick our officers of cavalry have acquired of galloping at everything, and then galloping back as fast as they galloped on the enemy. They never consider their situation, never think of manoeuvring before an enemy, so little that one would think they cannot manoeuvre except on Wimbledon Common, and when they use their arm as it ought to be used, viz. Offensively, they never keep nor provide for a reserve." So was Wellington's criticism fair? Were the British cavalry in the Peninsula ineffective? What were their strengths and weaknesses? Well, to answer these questions, I'm joined by Marcus Cribb, Cribb History on Twitter for those who are interested, to learn more about the cavalry arm and to try and discover how fair the criticism was. By the way, before we began, I've got a little bit of self-promotion, if you'll indulge me for a moment. My new book is ready to be ordered. It's called The Military History Geek's Guide to the Peninsular War, Volume 1, The Battles of Roliça, Vimero, Coruna and Talavera. I know, just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? But it is available on the Amazon Kindle already, and there'll soon be a paperback version and also an Apple Books version. So please do just search for the Military History Geek's Guide and you'll find it. It's the first of probably a four-book series on the Peninsula. So please check that out. It really helps support the podcast and make all this hard work worthwhile. So first off, can you just kind of introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what your interest in the period is.
Yes, certainly. So my name is Marcus Cribb. I'm currently the manager of Apsley House, which is also known as the Wellington Museum, or popularly Number 1 London, which was the Duke of Wellington's home after the Battle of Waterloo. And during the period of Waterloo, actually, his elder brother was living there. So it's a real hive of art history, because both the brothers really appreciated the finer arts, including music and classical painters. But it really just started delving me into what was originally a bit of a boyhood's interest into the Napoleonic era. And the further in I go, it's such a rich era of history, both military, politically and socially. I dabbled in a bit of the living history and reenactment, but I've spent all my life working in museums, running events or running the museums themselves. And so I like to bring them to life, and I love just going out and talking history. There's a lot of comments about the Battle of Waterloo and the Duke of Wellington, a lot of misattributed quotes and things like that. So it's really fun to try to engage with people and bring the facts to life.
Today we're here to talk about the cavalry, Wellington's cavalry, particularly during the Peninsular War. And what's your interest in that? I understand you've got a bit of a connection to the cavalry yourself. Is that correct?
Yes. By happy coincidence, I used to be in the Yeomanry, which is the British Army Cavalry Reserves. I'm currently in the Artillery Reserves, but that's actually got a Yeomanry history. So we've got our own history that's kind of aligned most of the yeomanry cavalry were formed in the late 1700s as a form of defence against invasion. So I've had a really nice chance to kind of delve in. Went deeper into the history of both the yeomanry and the cavalry to go out and give some talks to some of the serving soldiers at the beginning of this year, which was great to do.
Brilliant. And the regiments that you've served with, is there any Peninsular connection there or not?
At the time, no. At the time, the yeomanry were really home defence. So they were active service, but on the UK shores, doing everything from anti-smuggling to policing, because we didn't have a UK police force until the Duke of Wellington became Prime Minister. It was actually under Peel, but they're called the Peelers, but it was actually the Duke of Wellington was Prime Minister when they came in. But no, they were home defence. Mostly doing my regiment mostly did anti-smuggling work and up and down the coast and things like that.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, let's sort of maybe you could start by giving me a bit of a background to cavalry of the British cavalry of the period. I mean, can you give us a sense of how cavalry regiments were organised and what the different types of cavalry regiments were?
So they were all organised rather similarly, but they were split into two main branches of heavy and light. And they've all got their own different names, whether they're household cavalry or dragoon guards and dragoons. And then in the light, you've got light dragoons and hussars. And they later, not until after Waterloo, became lancers. And they were really meant to be split on different roles, for reconnaissance for the light cavalry and for hitting home at the enemy for the heavy cavalry. This wasn't always the case at all, especially under Wellington. He just kind of used all the cavalry the same, but they never had enough cavalry. You couldn't just have 700-800 men of the light cavalry just sat back waiting during a major engagement. So the light cavalry were primarily armed with sabers, the curved sword, which I've actually got behind me. And that's very much meant to be for running people down and slashing downwards. But the heavy cavalry, typically armoured helmets, they didn't wear the cuirassiers, which the French did, and they've got a long, straight sword. Typically meant to be bigger men, bigger horses, but there's a bit of a variation in between. But they're meant to be far more of a punching force directly towards the enemy, including their cavalry. And they're organised roughly the same. A regiment of cavalry doesn't have multiple battalions like an infantry, so you've just got a numeric regiment for most of them. The only exception being really the lifeguards. You've got like first and second lifeguards. So they're organised into troops. Troops are meant to be 100 men working together under a senior captain with like 2 junior lieutenants or ensigns. Then they would have a couple of sergeants making up there and a couple of corporals making up their full amount and 1 trumpeter. And you'd have 10 troops to a regiment. So in theory, 1,000 men with the additions of farriers, saddlers, uniform makers. You'd actually had veterinary surgeons attached. And the College of Veterinary Science had only been established about 6 years earlier. Mm-hmm. So it was a really new thing to have a qualified vet for every regiment. And they actually had veterinary assistants as well. So that was really forward thinking for its time. In practice, actually, they could never recruit 1,000 men multiple times over. So they were narrowed down initially to 100. And then they would take individual troops and send them out to the Peninsula and form them with 2 troops, form a squadron, and send anywhere between 2 to 6 squadrons overseas. So by the time they get out there, you would actually have regiments that were about 400 to 800 was the largest, but a bit smaller men. And that was common themes. And then you'd leave a few men back in Britain at the depot for training new recruits, but also new horses. It was a constant problem they had to find remounts and find new horses throughout the Peninsula.
So you mentioned the retreat to Corunna. And one of the battles that was fought at the start of that was Sahagun, which I've covered in the podcast. And Oman called that one of the sort of, I can't remember his exact words, but one of the greatest cavalry actions of the Peninsular War. And having read about it, it does seem that sort of man for man, the British cavalry seemed to be superior to the French. Is that something that was true of the Peninsula, or is that completely false?
It's really hard with like really broad statements, because probably overall the British Army was slightly better than the French, but the cavalry suffered a lot less from conscription than the French army, and certainly something the French normally have, apart from even at Sahagun, they were outnumbered 2-1. Is the French cavalry corps is much, much bigger up until about 1812, with the losing all their horses in the Russian campaign. So they tend to be pretty well matched. Again, it's a broad statement. Where the French cavalry tend to do better is they tend to have better officers. One of the kind of popular statements about the British cavalry at the time is that they would gallop at everything and then gallop back again. They had this really big reputation for overreaching. So they would go and do an attack, and then they would just keep going, especially famously at Waterloo, where the French completely exposed that. Where at Sahagun is the difference is they've got Paget, Handsome Henry Uxbridge, as he later is, and he's a fantastic cavalry commander. He really knows how to use them and also use the ground, a bit like Wellington knows how to use a reverse slope or go on the attack at the right time. Uxbridge knows how to use the terrain, get around behind the French and attack them at the opportune moments. And Sahagun, I think he catches the French so much that they're actually stationary and they try to defend themselves from a stationary position against sweeping in hussars, which is really difficult to do.
Yeah, I believe that was never a successful tactic during the Napoleonic era, was to stand still while being charged, but if you're cavalry yourself, correct?
Yeah, that's it. It's all about kinetic energy. It's about the kind of two forces of horse and man coming together, quick sweeps of the swords and passing and then wheeling round. So to be stationary, they've got the entire advantage. I guess it's a bit like sailing. They've got the wind on their side and they're coming in. So that's why Sahagun worked really well. The cavalry, they start off really quite strong. They're coming out of a lot of period of training, and they've gone through a series of reforms, which we'll probably come on to. But yeah, they're very good. They're very competent, but they are suffering from what the entire army is suffering from, that is under bad leadership. They're only as good as their leaders, and there were quite a few occasions where Uxbridge gets replaced by General Stuart, and he's just not fantastic. And there are times where he fails to make the charge at the right time. And I think it was during the Second Battle of Porto, his cavalrymen are just going, "Sir, you're just making the wrong decisions here, and you need to think about what you're doing. You're about to send, a squadron of men against a regiment. We're just all going to get massacred." And he's going, "Yeah, excellent. Just keep going, just keep following." And there's questions of his orders. So they really do suffer under their leadership. And Uxbridge, who's there during the Corunna campaign, is fantastic. He ends up going back. And I quite like the link. He goes back mostly because he elopes with Wellington's wife. Wellington's brother's wife. Sister. So it creates a huge scandal in Britain as well.
I feel like that's probably a whole nother podcast episode right there.
Yeah, Duke of Wellington and his family is a fantastic own topic.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it there, so now's a great time probably to bring it up. Can you tell us a little bit about those cavalry reforms that the British had gone through before the Peninsular War? What were they, and what changes had they made since the sort of beginning of the Revolutionary era?
So the cavalry were always this more fashionable area to go into. For example, the officers were actually paying a lot more to gain their commissions, but they hadn't been used very well. And they were really suffering from each regiment having its own training and having its own equipment. And they were bought in by the colonel. So there were some regiments that were found, for example, to have really weak swords because they're buying them at low cost. And some regiments were having really expensive uniforms, which the men would almost refuse to pay for. And it was observed that when they were fighting in what was termed the Low Countries, around the Netherlands, alongside the Austrians, the men they said they were lopping so wildly, they looked like woodsmen. And one of the worst things they would do is cut off their own horses' ears, because they're just going left, right, and going really wild. And I think he was major at the time, but he later became colonel. John Le Marchand, he French name, English family. He observed this and wrote these series of reforms to Horse Guards, which is British Army headquarters. And he said, we need some standardised training, because that didn't exist. You didn't go to somewhere and everyone received their training at the same time. It was done at the depot. So every regiment was different. So we need something standard. And also we need some swords. We can't just have this colonel has a better sword than that colonel, because when they're operating alongside, one regiment's going to break its swords and the other's going to succeed. So he wrote a pamphlet and then turned it into a book, which was adopted by the War Office, the army. And it included everything from drills that they practice and for how many hours and formations. Famously, a thing called the six cuts, which was like a figure of a Frenchman's face. It even had a little moustache on it. And they practiced these, so that they actually kind of put the sword out and rotate the wrist. It was all about wrist and forearm strength, and doing that on hours. And it also came with guards over head positions, and then also obviously swooping down. And so everybody could practice this. It was meant to be drawn or pasted on a wall, and they practiced for hours at end, as well as like kind of fencing drills. And the other thing Le Marchand did is he proposed the design of two main swords, a heavy cavalry sword and a light cavalry saber. And these were effectively a lot stronger, and they had a real purpose. So the heavy cavalry sword had a really wide hilt and basket. It was long, basically to be held out and used largely like a lance, a really long straight blade. It was what stamped down the side, warranted never to fail, which meant it was incredibly strong. It had two tangs, and you could hook it around the enemy's sword and hopefully disarm them. Whereas the light cavalry saber was weighted. I can show you.
So for those listening rather than watching, Marcus has just pulled a saber out from behind the sofa.
I'll do this for both listening and viewing. So the light cavalry sword, 1796 pattern. So if you're on a horse, you're naturally going to be bringing this down with a huge speed. And it's got just a slight curve, so you can't hold it in a straight line and stab it into the opponent. Really, it's going to be completely blunt on the back. But what it's designed for is to bring that weight down upon the enemy. And it was basically complained about by the French because the weight of it coming down, they couldn't sew it up. They've done experiments with like pig carcasses, and it won't just go through the flesh; it will break bones just the force of it because of that extra weight. It's a bit like a hammer head coming down. So it's got a huge amount of force behind them, but it's got areas on it that give it strength and give it some robustness, and so it's not going to break. But also importantly, it was then standardised so that all the light cavalry would have those swords, and all the heavy cavalry would have the 1796 pattern heavy cavalry sword. The only difference being, once again, the officers would tend to buy their own, but they would tend to be a version of that with just a nicer handle and nicer grip.
You presumably have practiced with these swords. How do they feel? When you're practicing with them, like do you feel they were probably pretty good weapons for what they were intended for?
They feel exactly that. They feel a really good weapon for what they're meant to be. But you really feel that kind of, there's a stereotype also about like British archers during the Battle of Agincourt having a huge right arm. And it feels like that. You really need to practice for 4 to 6 hours a day, which is what the troopers were doing. Something which I don't have the luxury to do every day, 6 days a week. And you would absolutely feel that these guys are going to be riding around, and probably their right arm is going to be twice the size of their left arm. I don't know if they've ever found any archaeological evidence of this, but they are going to be. It's got weight to it. It's quite difficult on foot, and you can see where the infantry officers were sometimes given these swords and the artillery, and you would really struggle. It's definitely designed something that is meant to be brought down from a height, and that being the advantage. So I've got the disadvantage that it's quite long. It would be quite difficult on the ground, but from a horse, which I've not had the luxury of doing yet. Maybe one day. It would be a really good weapon. Absolutely, it feels strong as well, and it feels like a nasty piece of work.
So I see on the bookshelf behind you, you've got at least one Sharp book of Bernard Cornwell. I can see now. Sharp, if I'm not mistaken, famously carried a sort of heavy cavalryman's sword. Is that completely unrealistic? Then would that have been completely ineffective for him on foot?
That's it. So they refer to it in the Sharp books as butcher's blade. So it's the 1796 heavy pattern. That's the light pattern that I held up. And it's really long. So basically the saber edge would be dragging along the ground. It would be almost like the sci-fi. You'd almost need it strapped to your back. It's going to be jangling around. If he's going to be running around rocks and skirmishing with his troops, it's going to be really impractical. But obviously, it gives a really nice difference for the books. He would have been issued really quite a thin, slightly curved sword, which had been redesigned for what they call the flank companies for the skirmishers, because they found that they were out and far more likely to be engaging with the French in hand-to-hand combat. But the heavy cavalry sword, it's something that if you were from the ground, I think you even see Sean Bean do it in the films. It's a bit of a two-handed motion. He's meant to be quite strong, but he's not going to have the luxury of what a heavy cavalry trooper is doing, which is the 6 hours training and having a huge right arm. So he'd probably be at genuinely a disadvantage. But I think it's also that fear factor. If you've got some snarling guy coming at you with a massive sword, and remember that most of the time when you're going to hand musket, you had a chance to fix bayonet. So you've got basically a club with a pointy end. So it's almost like a spear or halberd. If someone's coming at you with a sword, actually, they've suddenly got a bit of an advantage over you. Once they've gone past the reach, they can attack you. Otherwise, you're just trying to punch, fight, scratch them to death. There was quite a lot of examples of hand to hand. Even within towns, cavalry got involved sometimes, and it becomes really medieval.
Yeah. I imagine it wasn't a pleasant form of warfare, I guess. I mean, you were talking about Lamarchand and the doctrine that he wrote. Would he be the cavalry equivalent of Dundas then? Would that be a fair comparison?
Exactly. Yeah, he's the cavalry equivalent of Dundas, who wrote one of the two drill manuals, which is always confusing because there's Dundas and I've forgotten the other chap who, but neither of them are official. Or Dundas is later, and so it does lead to that slight confusion. Whereas Lamarchand's a relatively junior officer. I think he's a major when he writes his book, and then gets promoted to lieutenant colonel. But it does become official, which just kind of streamlines the cavalry and makes it a lot easier. Obviously, officers can choose to ignore it, but back at the depot, back in England, it can be easily followed, and it's genuinely a really helpful piece that when the cavalry arrive in the Peninsula, Wellington and subsequent commanders should know that this is that they are at, rather than having some that are weaker, some that are stronger. In theory, they're all used the same. I mean, when you get to Waterloo, you've got regiments there that have actually managed to miss the entirety of the Peninsular War. And infantry as well, but famously the Scots Greys with their glorious cavalry charge and all the paintings. They hadn't fought in all of the Peninsular War, but they're still meant to be thought of as quite good soldiers because they've received the same training. And that's something that you see today with modern armies. But back then, it was very a difference between the veterans and the raw recruits.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I read, and you'll be able to tell me if you would believe this or not, is that one of the reasons the British had this reputation for charging everything and then losing command of their men was the way the officers and the NCOs were placed in the line when they attacked, and that they weren't sort of hemming in the other ranks as well as, say, the French did. So therefore people kind of went off and did their own thing, and it was hard to pull them back. Would that be a fair assessment, or would you say that's probably not the reason?
Relatively fair. I think on paper there are meant to be sergeants to the rear and the sergeants on the corners of. I think they charge in either a 3 or 4 rank situation, and it depends on where the squadrons were placed. But typically the officers were meant to be out the front in a leadership role. And touching on what I said earlier, I mean they've purchased their commissions in. They tend to cost twice as much to purchase a cavalry commission as it does an infantry commission. So as a broad sweeping stereotype, they tend to come more from the aristocracy, and there's glory and honour, and they can talk about it. You might get a nice little dueling scar, and you talk to the ladies about that in London, and everyone would know that you're at the Battle of Sahagun or here and there, and you can be able to do paintings of you, and you'll become quite famous. And it was a fast route to celebrity. I better than joining Big Brother or something like that. So you're going to want to get out there, and you're not going to want to. I mean, a lot of the, as anyone who's studied military history knows, it's 99% boredom, and the cavalry spend a lot of their time on picket duty, which is like a 4th century duty. We had like 1 officer, 2 NCOs, and about 20 men guarding bridges And it's going to be an incredible amount of boredom with the French coming on. You have a little skirmish and you go back. So all of a sudden, all this pent-up energy, and they genuinely had a lot of anguish and hate of the enemy that builds up because of this. When it comes on, the impetus of the charge just drives them on and on and on. It happened so often. I think it was at Talavera, one of the Hussar regiments. They just kept charging. They didn't see a dry riverbed. And the whole regiment charged into it. Most of the horses breaking their legs, which anyone knows anything about equine, means that the animals will have to be killed. And the regiment is pretty much sent back to England with no horses from an engagement. They didn't even come into contact with me. They saw the enemy, charged them, and then just lost all the horses in one go. So and that was purely down to leadership, rather than looking at the ground and maybe going in at a trot.
Well, I tell you what, we've spoken quite a bit about the failures of the British cavalry. With the exception of Sahagun, we haven't spoken about any time they how would I put this? They performed well. Is there some examples from your knowledge of times where the British cavalry during the Peninsula performed very, very well and Wellington was happy with them?
Lots, luckily. They were good overall at what they were meant to do. The important ones really for the Peninsula are the boring picket jobs, which don't get many pages in a history book because it is a lot of time out. You'd have your infantry out, but actually beyond them, you'd have mostly your light cavalry. But Wellington often sends his heavy cavalry too, and just kind of mixes them all up. And it's really because a screen at night time to defend your forces, but also then the next day they're going off and doing reconnaissance. And Wellington's really reliant upon intelligence. He's got his exploring officers, he's got his guerrillas, but his infantry are often going off and collecting intelligence and scouting towards the enemy. And it's something they become really quite proficient at.
You said the infantry. Did you mean the cavalry there? Sorry, you said the infantry often went off. Did you mean the cavalry or?
Cavalry, yeah. The infantry didn't really. I said the infantry. Maybe it's because I'm looking at Sharp, but the other side of me. They didn't really do as you see in Sharp. You don't really see the rifles going off and providing like special forces missions. But the cavalry are going off and kind of going. They didn't really have proper lines apart from at night time. So they're going off very close to the French forces and skirmishing with their cavalry. Going on to the main battles, one of the greatest ones, in my opinion, Wellington's greatest battle. In Wellington's opinion, it was although everyone writes about Waterloo, it was Salamanca. So Salamanca in 1812 is Wellington's better battle than Waterloo by a country mile. And there, just to really briefly summarise it, Wellington's kind of marching alongside the French army for 6 days. He spots a gap in the French advance. He goes on the offensive. In fact, he rides across the entire field to bring in the 3rd Division, led by his brother-in-law, Ned Pakenham, and rides back, outstripping all of his officers. He's a really good horseman. And the 3rd Division come in, but they come in with their cavalry right on the French flank. And they at the perfect time. In fact, Le Marchand, who we mentioned about the reforms, he's leading a regiment at that time. And they capture the French in squares, and the infantry move up with really good support. And so they then start firing at the French. And mathematically, they're going to have a huge frontage against their narrow. So they start decimating the French squares. They go round or kind of outflanking like either side of a cresting wave, the French squares, and go into the French line behind, which is currently marching, and completely overrun the French positions. So much so they famously capture 2 eagles, the famous French standards, and bring those back. Unfortunately, during that time, John Le Marchand, the colonel, was actually killed and shot from his saddle. So we don't know how much of a fantastic cavalry commander he could have gone on to be. But they caused such disarray, they almost managed to capture the 3rd and the final French column. And so by the time they're coming back, the French marching column in the middle is in disarray and, pretty much decimated. And the French squares are having to stay in squares because they're keeping up the pressure. And it's this rock, paper, scissors of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. And if they manage to keep an infantry in squares, where you've got infantry in line, they are going to be cutting through the paper and pushing on. and it's a really good use of like a tri-armed forces of artillery, infantry, and cavalry working together. And the cavalry do it. Like Salamanca is a brilliant battle of them just hitting the timing right, pushing through, but then realizing finally when they've gone too far and coming back and supporting infantry rather than overstretching.
Brilliant, because we haven't reached Salamanca yet in my sort of narrative of the Peninsular War, so that's a great introduction for people, and hopefully when we get there I can go into some great detail about that.
It's one of my favourites. So they say Wellington won a battle in 45 minutes, and I'll let you talk about it. He's got a chicken leg, and that's always the bit to look out for when he's eating his chicken leg. It's all going to go well from that.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to hearing the backstory on that. So just going back a little bit then, more into the sort of nitty-gritty, you mentioned recruitment earlier and you talked about officers. I was interested in terms of the rank and file. Were they recruited the same way as the infantry? You know, did they have recruiting parties go around, or was it much more popular arm to join? Would the rank and file perhaps have differed socio-economically to the infantrymen, perhaps?
Well, yes, but on paper I found it a really interesting point to find, because they actually wanted people who didn't have equine experience. They wanted people who they could kind of find from an equal playing field, which when you look at things like the First World War, as an example, when they're forming tank corps, they're looking for people with mechanical experience. They want some sort of basic knowledge. Whereas in theory, no, they wanted people who were really like had base level and they could them themselves. But in practice, they actually found that they were more popular to recruit from the countryside, where people might have equine experience, and this would often come, from farm horses. We're still really a rural nation, Britain, in the 1800s. However, this played to a huge advantage because you've got one vet, maybe an assistant vet for 1,000 horses. So it becomes really common that both the farriers and they have an equivalent of a troop sergeant major are basically leading in horse welfare. And anyone who can bring something, because even human diseases they're really struggling with, anyone who can bring in some knowledge, some equine care. And remember, they're not only loving their animals, and I think that's often not portrayed. They do genuinely love their animals, but they need their horses as their weapon of war as well. So horse care is really important. So they are actually finding quite a lot that they actually the skills they're picking up and bringing in is there. It's not particularly for the common soldier, a more popular, less popular branch. I think overall, soldiers are joining the army at the time through a bit of patriotism, but mostly through a motivation for a wage, for money, food, or for a chance to escape Britain because of maybe some crime they've committed. So the branch they join really doesn't matter that much to them. Pay is relatively similar. The difference I found is also some colonels are coming in because they've got this grand idea. I think it was the 16th Light Dragoons. The colonel had from Scottish aristocracy. He wanted it to become a Scottish regiment. So he's going off and sending recruiting parties to Glasgow and Perthshire primarily. And go, bring me lots of Scots, And they're coming back like 2 or 3 men. They're going to Liverpool and they're coming back with 10 or 12 men. Then they go to Ireland and they're coming back with 30 and 40 men. So Ireland's still the main recruiting pool. And he actually has to stop sending men to Ireland because he's got this idea of turning the 16th Light Dragoons into a Scottish regiment. And very quickly, they're about 45% Irish. And he's going, we're suddenly going to be labelled Irish Dragoons. And I really want them to be Scottish. So we're going to have to stop that. So it's broadly, the infantry have a similar thing that at any points, the British Army was about a third to a quarter Irish, even in the English, air inverted commas, regiments. So it does broadly reflect the wider regiments and the wider army.
Yeah, okay. And then I wanted to ask, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but it's because I genuinely don't have a big knowledge of the cavalry arm, so I'm kind of interested and sort of my brain's just sort of moving around. What was Wellington's opinion of his cavalry in general? I know there's a couple of famous quotes and so on, but do you know what his general opinion was, and if he sort of tried not to use his cavalry if he could help it? What would be your opinion?
No, he definitely used his cavalry when he could. He was he's often thought of as a defensive general, but I like to think of actually he's a defensive when he needs to be. In places like Salamanca, he goes on the offensive, and he certainly uses his cavalry. Like I say, he doesn't really mind too much whether they're heavy or light. At the end of the day, they're on a horse, they've got a big sword, we're going to send them in. And he kind of leaves that to his cavalry commanders, either Uxbridge and then Stapleton Cotton later, briefly Stuart. And he kind of leaves that to them. So he doesn't have a huge interest in them particularly. Something he's always saying, actually, one of his biggest complaints is he doesn't have enough. He's always saying, I don't have enough cavalry. I mean, he's always saying he doesn't have enough of everything. He's always outnumbered. I can barely think of a handful of battles in the Peninsular War where he's got numbers on his side, not till right at the end of the campaign. He's nearly always outnumbered. But he's always saying that, actually, I've not got enough cavalry because we're having to go and do scouting duties with them. We're losing them in battle, but also we're losing so many men and horses to disease. And no, genuinely an okay opinion of them. It's not like some regiments who've got a reputation for deserting. When you read it, there's really interesting regiments like the infantry, like the Chasseurs Britanniques, who were mostly foreign emigres, and they were famous for deserting at night. The cavalry, I think he just doesn't quite get in depth with them, which is unusual for Wellington because he's a real micromanager. When you look at Waterloo, inviting individual messages, look at Salamanca, himself rather than sending an aide de camp. He does kind of tend to leave the cavalry corps to kind of their own devices and then bring them in when he needs them, which is relatively unusual. But he does do that with the artillery as well. He kind of focuses on the big picture and then goes to individual regiments. But I just don't think he gets to grips with the cavalry enough, probably because he just doesn't have enough time. He's so busy with the politics of the Spain and Portugal, the politics of organising the exploring officers and the guerrillas, and the Spanish and Portuguese court he's having to constantly deal with. And he doesn't really like having a second in command. So he works incredibly long days and dealing with that. So it's too low down his list, which is a bit of a shame. But he does write about the cavalry. He does have those famous quotes, but he doesn't use as much as some other aspects of his war, like the supplies and logistics is a bigger headache maybe.
Final thought then, would you say that actually the cavalry's biggest significance in the Peninsula wasn't the big battles, it was a lot of the other work they were doing? And if so, can you give us a couple of examples?
Yes, I think it is actually. They make some really dynamic cavalry charges, and that's what's written about. But majority of their war is going to be spent on picket duties, but on scouting reconnaissance missions as well. They're also doing things like they're protecting routes. They're doing these rearguard actions, and they're actually sometimes assisting provost marshals in policing duties as well. And so the majority of their time is going to be far more mundane, but that's what makes up the majority of a campaign. Wellington's army spends far more time marching than it does fighting. And I think that's what's really important, is to kind of understand that within the regiment, you've got these men. And I said quite early near the beginning that these men who've actually got a real love and affinity with their horses, but you don't see that very often. And when you read accounts of men's horses dying and then breaking down in tears, or worse still, when they've been told that they need to leave the horses behind, they don't want to leave them to the French, having to kill them, it's really breaking the men, and there's some really tragic scenes. So the war's a bit more mundane for the lot of it. And then all of a sudden you've got these glorious cavalry charges going in. And I think that's where the pent-up energy, that's where you maybe can excuse the officers and the regiments. This pent-up energy for months and years of campaigning. All of a sudden the enemy are there in front of them. You've caught them, and we're going to go and attack them. And it is for honour, for glory. The flags are waving, the trumpets are going, and it's going to stir something inside almost anyone, but especially when you add in the boredom, the starvation, the cold nights, and all of a sudden that's their one moment. That's what they're going to have to do. And majority of it, they perform admirably for Wellington. And so he doesn't write about them as much as some of his other regiments, and so there's less information. But some of his officers, some of the cavalry officers, do keep diaries, and those are quite interesting to delve into and read.
Brilliant. Well, Marcus, I think I've kept you enough. I think that was absolutely brilliant. I've learned a lot because, like I say, it's not a branch I know a lot about. So if anyone wants to sort of engage in conversation with you further, how can they best reach you? What's the best way to contact you?
So I've kind of started doing far more on Twitter. I think I'm mcribb history for Marcus Cribb history on Twitter. I'm on loads of different chat rooms on Facebook, especially at the minute. And a friend of mine, Josh, digital friend, he runs Land of History, and I think you're talking to him as well. And we're doing YouTube videos as well about Wellington. We're currently doing Waterloo, but then we want to talk about more aspects of his later life and maybe his boyhood, and so we can talk about him as a person. So hopefully people, if they're enjoying your videos, might go and have a look at those as well.
So another cracking episode there, great interview with Marcus. I learned a ton from that, and I hope you did too. Marcus is now a friend of mine, and he'll be back on the podcast again in December to talk about the Battle of Talavera and his love for the Sharp series of books by Bernard Cornwell. To make sure you don't miss an episode, and also to keep updated on all my videos, please pop on over to my website, redcoathistory.com, and subscribe. I'll see you guys there. Thanks a lot.